I'm Seth Embry, Senior Advisor and Chief Strategist for the Housing Authority of Birmingham District. Excited to bring you a conversation about fair housing and the history here in Birmingham and the civil rights movement as we celebrate and commemorate April, which is Fair Housing Month. I'm here with DeJuana Thompson, who is the Vice Chair of our Board of Commissioners, in addition to lots of other things. But why don't you introduce yourself?
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about this important conversation. Again, my name is DeJuana Thompson. I'm the President and CEO of the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, and I do have the pleasure of serving as the Vice Chair of the Birmingham Housing Authority.
Right. So just big context, right? Birmingham is known as a integral part of the civil rights movement here in America.
Ever.
Right? And so as a transplant to Birmingham, that is pretty much the only thing I knew about Birmingham ever. Right? Civil rights, Birmingham, period,
right.
Stop, that's it. But a lot of us, outside the city probably know that movement about a struggle for racial equality and employment and public accommodations and things of that nature. And not so much about fair housing and housing discrimination.
Right.
But that was certainly a part of the overall civil rights movement, but also part of the struggle here in Birmingham for equal rights for African Americans. So can you talk a little bit about that context and how civil rights and fair housing played together in the struggle for civil rights?
So I think what's interesting to note, Seth, is that housing was actually the most prominent thing that started the civil rights movement. And well before the voting rights, well before sort of even equal rights conversation, it was this issue of housing discrimination and housing disparity. And that in the early 30s and 40s is what the NAACP was working on. It was what individuals like Arthur Shores Lee were working on because Birmingham being an industrial complex, and part of the way in which they were bringing in industry was to build communities and neighborhoods for the industry that it was bringing in. Well, even though at that time, early 40s, 30s and 40s, African Americans made up over 40% of the city at that time, literally it was legislated that they could only live in about 11% of the communities that were created. So you can already imagine right now, if you're 40% of the community and you can only live in 11% of the spaces that have been, or the communities that have been created for housing, that's already putting you at a significant disadvantage. And so before we can even talk about voting rights and all that, we just trying to stay somewhere. We're just trying to live and have access to housing for our families, while we're also just as responsible to building this industrial magic city that everybody, was content on building. And so I think it's really important. Housing was really the impetus of the civil rights movement in Birmingham, and it led to other issues, or opening up itself to other issues down the road.
And that is really fascinating because like you talked about voting, we can talk about the lunch counters and things of that nature, but just the ability to live in a safe home in a community that you want to is critical. And it's the work that we continue to do now as a housing authority. Yeah. And I've looked back in our own records, and you think about developments like Southtown or Islington or Smithfield, where we have these active redevelopment projects, and you can see when these properties were constructed that this was a Negro development or this was a white development. And it's, as a commissioner, I look through the meeting minutes and I see that conversation. Is very interesting to think about that going on at the time and place where it was thought to be acceptable to house people based on color in certain communities.
Yeah, I think, zoning, this country's history with zoning is already notorious, right? But particularly in the city of Birmingham, they were using zoning to create the quasi-color line and barrier in the city. So they knew if they would intentionally create the zoning variances that said, okay, we're going to put this community over here across from this railroad track, or, what they could intentionally create a barrier and a color line without institutionalize it. Now, Jim Crow comes later and says, we're not trying to do it behind the scenes anymore. No, you're going to stay where you're supposed to stay, and we're going to stay where we're supposed to stay. You see the progression of that, quite frankly, that violence and that terrorism proceed in that way. But in the beginning, they used zoning ordinances to create that city that they wanted, that look that they wanted, which was those who have and those who, you know, are considered the better part of society. We want them to have their neighborhoods over here, we don't want them to feel like they have to be adjacent to this other element of individuals over here. And, you know, in the Institute, we actually have an exhibit about the zoning in the housing, because it's critical for people to understand that, yes, that was a hard thing to endure, but what it also did was it created a urgency for African Americans and minority communities to build their spaces and to build what they need as well, and to force the city to give them certain resources. So, you know, I always try to say, you know, seeds today, fruit tomorrow. Those who fought through that time period are the benefactors of the work, you know, where we are now.
Right. And that is incredible. I love that phrase, seeds. You said seeds today, fruit tomorrow. Because we love the fruit, but I mean, you're talking about the 30s and the 40s.
Yeah.
And you mentioned Arthur Shores, and his story is phenomenal here in Birmingham, and his activism and his legal career, and including him being front and center in the critical part of that housing movement, just by nature of where he decided to live and have his family. So talk a little bit about that, and because people, you know, one of the first things someone ever said to me about Birmingham was Birmingham, and I had no idea
I was just, I said, let me make sure I got all my notes, because I wanted to be sure. I like to say with accuracy the names of folk and what they were doing in the court cases and all of that, and it's a lot of history to keep in mind. But I'm glad that we are centering Arthur Shores in this conversation, because what he did was really so strategic and so ahead of his time in a lot of ways, because what he was able to see ahead of time was, this is where this is going.
Right.
So let me try to do something before to create this like lane before it happens. What do I mean by that? Him and Jefferson Drew, who at that time owned a insurance company, they began to buy up property in these places that had not been zoned yet, and that had been historical areas where non-African Americans were living, right? So they kind of secretly and quietly started buying up all of these properties ahead of the case that he would bring about housing and discrimination, which was the Monk case, correct? And so even when we start to see this conversation, or we start to see the leadership of the city move towards this segregation model, what they could not do was take his property from him, right? But what that ended up as a result in was those houses and those spaces being bombed.
Yeah.
So the retaliation of that strategy, the retaliation of being thoughtful and brilliant and trying to create something in the middle of chaos, was met with that sort of brute force and resistance. And so you have neighborhoods like Smithfield, right, which was the center for bombing in the city. So I think it's something like 50 bombs alone were set off in that area. And of those 50, none of them were solved, right? And so they kept building back, though.
Yeah.
And I think that is the most dynamic part of that story, is that, you know, in the face of incredible odds, they knew it was still important to stand their ground in a lot of ways and say, hey, we belong in these neighborhoods. We built these neighborhoods, and whatever you're going to do, it may be a threat to, you know, we're not going to be threatened. We're going to build back in our neighborhoods.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So that's powerful enough to end the conversation. But I do want to ask, you would call yourself technically a lifelong resident of Birmingham. I know you've been other places, right?
Yeah.
But this is your city.
Yeah.
So what would you think today about how the history of segregation shaped what Birmingham is today? And is that a strength? Is that not a strength? What would you think about that?
Well, segregation is never, I would never consider segregation a strength of any community. what I will say is that people rise to the occasion based off of whatever situation that they're put into. And so again, what segregation did do was it forced particularly Black and marginalized communities to build what they needed and to be self-sustaining communities in the face of this hate that was happening. And I think that that's how you got, a thriving 4th Avenue business district. That's how you got places like Tulsa, right? And again, because of that, those places were also targeted. But when we look at today, with Birmingham being over 70% African American, and a lot of these neighborhoods that were once zoned where they could not live, they now can live, I would be remiss to say that there hasn't been progress. What I think that we are seeing that is a remnant of failed policy and or policy that actually did not fail, like segregation, is things like food deserts, right? We're still seeing some remnant of disparity in how resources come into certain communities versus others. And that's the work that we still have to do, right? And I think that what's also really important to note is that the cost of living is increasing all over the country. And so as we look at economic justice, right, as we look at the opportunity for people to educate their children in an equal sort of environment that has the same amount of resources, all of those things have its roots in some form of prejudice from the past, but that there have been opportunities for us to move forward, and there's still opportunities for us to do that work today. But I'm excited because I believe that the work that we do at the Housing Authority, I believe that the focus of the current administration of the city of Birmingham, I believe that the neighborhood housing leaders and our community leaders all have an idea that all of our neighborhoods should be fit, should be accessible, should have the resources that they need, and we're all moving in that direction for a greater Birmingham.
Right, all 99. Right?
All 99. 99 neighborhoods, 23 communities.
Well, listen, I thank you for this conversation. I think I can already see us needing to have a conversation. You talk about economic justice, environmental justice, all these topics that come from the history of Birmingham and where we decided to place certain people in the legacy of that today. But I'm like you, excited about the work that we continue to do at the Housing Authority in combination with all those partners that you mentioned. So I thank you for your time today.
It's an exciting time to be in Birmingham.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.